Once again, my name is Patrick Huff, and we're going to be talking about many things today that I hope will be very informative to you. And maybe we'll have a few red pill moments taking place in the audience today, a reference to the Matrix. Think back, if you will, as far back as you can remember, when you began to hear that we are having a crisis in education. My memories go back to the early 90s on that issue. When I was in school and when I was in my earliest stages of my career, we heard how students failed and dropouts and the like, and our job was to try our best to prevent that from happening. But beginning in the 90s, we began to hear a term that was bandied about called low performing. Well, in Texas, we had an accountability system set up at that time, and it was state-run, and we had a standardized test that was used. It was called TOS, although we had two prior versions before that, TABS and TEAMS. But TOS was not a bad test, and a lot of schools were doing well in meeting the accountability standards related to TOS. Well, beginning in 2001, things changed. The federal government got involved in the accountability system, and they injected two items into the picture. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And with their injection of their standards into the accountability system, then we began to hear shortly thereafter more terms being used of low performing and school failure. So it's my hope today that as we go through the part of my presentation, you will pick up on what school reform is really all about. And you'll understand what school failure is all about as well. And so where I want to go first, I want you to wrap your brain around that top headline. School failure is a myth. And if you can come to believe that, then by the time we get done today, you'll understand that every agenda item that comes before the legislature is built upon the notion of failing schools or low-performing schools. Students, let me just preface one thing. I'm a university professor, adjunct professor at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and I work in the Ed Leadership Department. I'm in the schools often. I get to watch teachers in their daily duties, and I see how much hard work is being done. Let me tell you, miracles are being done every day in the public school system. The overarching justification for all the school interventions and restructuring is built around low performance or failing schools. So this is simply a false narrative. And so as we go through the presentation, I think this will become evident to you. The schools that are reported as failing are actually working miracles every day in the very challenging environments that they have to work in. Let's go back to No Child Left Behind. We don't need to go any further back than that. With No Child Left Behind in 2001, and then when it was initiated in 2002, the federal government, as I said, injected themselves into the accountability system. They created a mechanism that, when implemented, would lead most school districts in the country to failure. And that was AYP, or what we call adequate yearly progress. So AYP was placed in motion a progressive series of percentages that was required for public schools to meet. And they were required to be met in each of the subgroup populations. And those were African American, Hispanic, white, economically disadvantaged, English language learners, and special education. Here in Texas, we had the first four, and then the federal government added the last two. And those were two very big accountability subgroups for them to inject into the system. So the percentages were moving toward a goal to be reached by 2014. If you remember, George Bush made the declaration when No Child Left Behind was passed that by 2014, all students would be proficient. So what happened with that? That meant that by 2014, 100% of the students had to be proficient, and proficient meant passing the test. So an interesting thing happened on the way to 2014. All of a sudden, guess what? We had a crisis in education. Oh my goodness, we need to have lots of meetings. We need to spend lots of money on determining just why the schools are failing. Well, it really didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why they were failing. What was going on? Were the teachers doing a bad job? Were the administrators not running their schools effectively? Or was it the percentages that were going up? So reaching 100% by 2014 was not just a goal, that would have been a worthy goal, unrealistic goal, but a worthy goal. But no, AYP and the 100% mandate was put into law. That meant that different types of sanctions had to be met along the way. And there had to be a situation in place or a program in place that would deal with placing those sanctions on the schools when they did not measure up to whatever the percentage that was required then for that year. And that was the school improvement program. So once in the program, it was next to impossible to get out of the program because you would work, trying to get your kids remediated and have enough remediated where you could pass the test, and then, lo and behold, the percentage would go up the next year. It really was a catch-22. So by 2012, we had problems in our public schools. The percentages were 83% required in math and 87% required in ELA. That meant that each subgroup had to hit that percentage collectively. In other words, 83% of your African American kids, your Hispanic kids, your white kids, 83% had to pass the test. And what happened? By 2012, it was chaos around the nation. We had districts failing everywhere. We had superintendents clamoring for help. We had people in Congress meeting to figure out what to do. Well, a funny thing happened on the way to 100% public school failure. President Obama issued his, what has become the waiver. The waiver was the U.S. Department of Education flexibility package. And what did the waiver waive? It waived the 100% mandate. It waived a number of other things too, but it waived the 100% mandate that was required by 2014. The handwriting was on the wall. States knew they weren't going to make it. Districts knew they weren't going to make it. They hadn't made it in 2010. They didn't make it again in 2011 or 12. What made them think they would magically make it by 14? Now keep in mind, let's go back so I can make this point. Once you got into the school improvement program, that was the second year that you failed to meet standards. Once you got into that program, then you were on a treadmill to failure. Complete shutdown, complete takeover. The items were in place each year. The sanctioning was getting heavier each year. That's why it was next to impossible to get out of the school improvement program, because the percentages went up the next year. And provisions were put in place where, as in Texas, the Texas Education Agency could come in and take over the school. And in fact, they did on a few occasions before we got the waiver. Okay. So I call it a get out of jail free card, but actually, it wasn't so free after all. By taking the waiver, many provisions of No Child Left Behind were waived, the most being the 100% mandate. But another thing that happened that you had to do was you had to link the teacher and principal evaluation to the outcomes on the test. So this guaranteed, when this element came into play, it guaranteed that if the teacher was going to be evaluated by the percentages, part of their evaluation, not all of it, but part of their evaluation. They were going to be evaluated on how many students that they had passed the test. By golly, they were going to make sure they passed the test. And so this lended to more teaching to the test. So people hear that phrase being used a lot. Teachers only teach to the test. Well, why is that? Because of the waiver that President Obama issued by executive order, by the way. And that guaranteed that because of the evaluation structure being the way it is, all teachers would be teaching to the test. We can't blame the teacher for that. Finally, the state had to submit their own accountability plan. Oh, I forgot one of the most important ones. You had to link your standards to Common Core. Now, they called it rigorous college and career-ready standards. Well, that's just a euphemism for Common Core. Everyone knows that now. And in Texas, we did just that. The waiver specified, if you go back and read the elements in the waiver, the language, it actually says that ELA standards are linked to Common Core, and they are 90% linked to Common Core. And in math, they're 75% linked to Common Core. This is the language that's actually in the waiver that was written by Commissioner Williams and his team at TEA and submitted to Arnie Duncan for approval at the U.S. Department of Education. So we have linked to the Common Core, teacher and principal evaluation on the test, and then finally, you had to submit your own accountability measures for how you were going to get your students proficient on the test. Already talked about that. So let's look at something that's very interesting. We began using a different term rather than AYP. We began calling them annual measurable objectives. And that was done in 2013. This is the updated version of 2015 and 16. And this is the federal AYP chart, if you really want to know what it is. So we can see right there in 2015 and 16, the percentage that was required for federal accountability was 87%. And you can see how it goes up each year, according to your subgroups at the top. And come down to 2019 and 20, and there we go. They haven't abandoned the 100%, it's still there. Now, I have been told by none other than our commissioner, Mike Morath, that we don't use this anymore. Well, if we don't use this anymore, then why are we being graded by it? Because here's an example of a federal report card. It's from one of Texas's large school districts. I've taken out the name so you can't see who it is. I don't want to shame anybody. But this is a federal report card, and it's public information, and you can find it on the TEA website. And as you can see here, we come down a little bit to part 2, and we see our state target lines of 60%. And we see that most everybody passed that. African American folks had a little trouble with it, getting that mark in this particular district. But let's come down a little bit further, and we see our federal performance. Federal target, 87%. Did anybody pass that? What does the N mean? It means no, of course. Okay, so there's 87%. That's on the federal AMO objectives for 2015-16, and this is in every public school district that we have in the state of Texas. This happens to come from one of our larger ones. 2015-16, 87%, 87%. Okay? So I'm told it's not being used, but if it's not being used, then why are we reporting on it? And what's going to happen when more and more districts don't meet the AMO guideline? All right, let's move on. What we really focus on in Texas is what we call the index system. And there are 4 indices. Next year there will be 5. They are student outcomes, student progress, closing performance gaps, and post-secondary readiness. And each index has a target line that has to be met. If you don't meet it, then you have trouble with TEA. They either get met standards or improvement required. Now we have A through F coming in 2017 and 18 school year. That's next fall. Districts will be graded A through F. So the commonality with our system and No Child Left Behind is that the schools that are affected the most with negative outcomes and excessive sanctions and takeovers are the Title I schools. This is the reality on the ground. The factors that determine the outcomes for school accountability have absolutely nothing to do with ethnicities. This is very important to understand. It has nothing to do with ethnicities. So what does it have to do with? 3 factors. If you go back to every school report card, you can pretty much predict what the outcomes are going to be for that particular school based on these 3 demographic areas. We have economically disadvantaged, ELLs, which are your English language learners, and your mobility rate. So when the percentages in these 3 categories go up, just like AYP, schools begin to come down with their outcomes on the test. When those percentages are very low, the outcomes are very high. When those percentages go high, then those outcomes come down. And when they get to the point where they can no longer remediate the number of kids that are failing the test, then the whole school fails. It's all about remediation. How many kids can you get to? And this is all part of the school strategy for attacking the test and how to get your percentages up. It's how many kids can we reach? And so they begin to pick and choose. The ones that they know are going to pass the test.